Tonight, I invite you to a quiet corner of Covent Garden, a place that grows still as evening settles in, where a small shop window glows warmly through the fog. It is a toymaker's workshop, filled with the scent of wood, paint, and old memories. Before the story begins, stay here with me for just a moment. Let your breathing slow, let your shoulders soften, because what follows will not hurry you. It will do the opposite. When you are ready, the door to the Toymaker's shop opens gently. The morning came to Covent Garden, as it always did, slowly and with a certain reluctance, as if the night were unwilling to release its hold upon the narrow streets and close-pressed buildings. The fog lay thick in the lanes and alleyways, softening every edge and corner, transforming the familiar geography of the market district into something dreamlike and uncertain. Through this gray veil, the first sounds of the day began to emerge. The distant cry of a costermonger preparing his barrow, the slow clip of a horse's hooves on wet cobblestones, the creak of shutters being opened somewhere out of sight. The gas lamps had not yet been extinguished, and their yellow light made soft halos in the fog, each one an island of warmth suspended in the general grayness. A cart rumbled past, its wheels finding every uneven stone, the sound arriving muffled and distant, though the cart itself was near. Footsteps came and went, some purposeful, some hesitant, all of them softened by the thick air until they seemed no more substantial than whispers. In a narrow street that ran between the main market and the theater district, there stood a shop front that had weathered many such mornings. It was a small establishment, hardly more than 12 feet wide, pressed between a print seller's shop on one side and a seller of sheet music on the other. The building rose 3 stories above the street, but it was the ground floor that drew the eye, or would have drawn it, had anyone been watching at this early hour. The window was small but meticulously clean, and behind the glass could be seen an arrangement of wooden toys, a painted horse with real horsehair for its mane and tail, a mechanical bear that could be made to walk by turning a key in its side, a set of 9 pins, each carved and painted to represent a different character from nursery rhymes, and a Noah's Ark complete with pairs of animals so small and delicate they seemed to have been carved by fairy hands. The toys were arranged with evident care, positioned to catch what light there was, and even in the gray dawn, they possessed a certain quality of life, as if they were only waiting for the proper moment to wake and move about. Above the window, painted on a wooden sign that hung from an iron bracket, were the words, A. Bellamy, maker of fine toys and curiosities. The paint had faded somewhat over the years, but the letters remained clear, and the sign itself, though old, had been maintained with obvious care. It swung very slightly in the morning breeze, producing a faint creaking sound that mingled with the other soft noises of the awakening street. Within the shop, all was still dark. The shutters remained closed, the door locked, the interior wrapped in the particular silence that belongs to places where work is done, but where, for the moment, no work is being undertaken. The darkness held within it the shapes of many things: workbenches and shelves, tools and half-finished projects, toys in various stages of completion, all waiting, patient as the fog, for the day to properly begin. The minutes passed slowly, measured by the distant chiming of church bells. First one bell, then another, then several together, their voices rising through the fog to announce the hour. 6 o'clock. The city was waking, though not yet fully awake. The market sounds grew gradually louder. The rumble of more carts, the calls of vendors beginning to arrange their goods, the general murmur of commerce preparing to commence. And then, From the door that led to the floors above the shop, there came the sound of footsteps on wooden stairs, slow footsteps, careful and measured, descending one step at a time. Each step produced its own particular note. Some stairs creaked, others groaned softly, a few were silent. The footsteps knew these sounds, anticipated them, accepted them as familiar companions. A key turned in a lock, somewhere in the darkness, and the door at the bottom of the stairs opened. A figure appeared, barely visible, in the dim light that crept around the edges of the shutters. The figure moved with the deliberate slowness of age, not infirm exactly, but conscious of the body's limitations and unwilling to test them unnecessarily. There was a pause, a moment of stillness, and then the strike of a match. A small sound, sharp and sudden in the quiet. The match flared, and in its brief light, one could see a pair of hands holding it, old hands marked with the signs of long labor, the skin spotted and creased, the fingers slightly gnarled, but still capable. Still, sure. The hands moved the match to a lamp that stood on a small table near the door, and the lamp's wick caught, the flame spreading and steadying until it cast a warm circle of light that pushed back the darkness for several feet in all directions. In that light, more could now be seen. The hands belonged to an elderly man dressed in clothing that spoke of modest circumstances, maintained with care, dark trousers, a waistcoat of gray cloth, a white shirt with a collar that had been washed many times, and over all, a long brown apron, its pockets sagging with the weight of small tools. The man's face was gentle, deeply lined, with kind eyes that held the particular softness that comes from a lifetime of working with one's hands to create things meant to bring joy to children. This was Mr. Arthur Bellamy, and he had been making toys in this shop for longer than many people had been alive. He was 73 years old, though he rarely thought about his age except when his knees protested the climb up the stairs or his fingers grew stiff on cold mornings. He had been born in this building, had learned his trade from his father in this very workshop, and had continued that work through all the years since, creating wooden horses and painted dolls, mechanical birds and puzzle boxes, tin soldiers and miniature theaters. He stood for a moment, holding the lamp, allowing his eyes to adjust to the light and his mind to adjust to wakefulness. This moment of standing still, of simply being present in the space where he spent his days, was as much a part of his morning ritual as lighting the lamp itself. He looked around the workshop, seeing without needing to focus his attention, the familiar shapes, the known locations of tools and materials, the comforting presence of his life's work. Setting the lamp on the workbench that occupied the center of the room, Mr. Bellamy moved to the window. His movements were slow, but purposeful, economical in the way that comes from long practice. He unfastened the shutters, swinging them back and securing them against the wall, and the gray morning light entered the shop, mixing with the warmer glow of the lamp. Through the window, he could see the street gradually becoming visible as the fog thinned slightly, the outlines of buildings across the way, the shapes of early pedestrians, the bulk of a wagon passing by. He turned from the window and lit 2 more lamps, one near the back of the shop where the shelves of finished toys stood waiting, and one above a smaller workbench in the corner where delicate painting work was done. As each lamp was lit, more of the workshop revealed itself. The walls were lined with shelves from floor to ceiling, and upon these shelves rested toys of every description. Some were new and bright with fresh paint. Others were older pieces that Mr. Bellamy kept for reasons he could not always articulate, favorites from years past. examples of techniques he had mastered, toys that held particular memories. The floor of the workshop was wooden, worn smooth by decades of footsteps, and scattered here and there were small curls of wood shavings, evidence of yesterday's work. Mr. Bellamy fetched a broom from the corner and began to sweep, gathering the shavings into a small pile. The sound of the broom's bristles against the wood was soft and rhythmic, almost musical, and he moved with the unhurried pace of one who has swept this floor thousands of times and will sweep it thousands more, God willing. When the floor was tidy, he emptied the shavings into a wooden box kept for that purpose. The shavings would be used later to pack delicate toys for shipping, or given to a neighbor who used them to start fires, or sometimes simply kept because their scent was pleasant. The smell of fresh-cut wood, of pine and oak, and sometimes the sweeter scent of fruitwood. Mr. Bellamy moved next to his main workbench, where several projects lay in various stages of completion. There was a rocking horse, nearly finished, requiring only its final coat of varnish. There was a set of building blocks, each one precisely cut and sanded, waiting to be painted, with letters and numbers. There was a small wooden train, its locomotive, and 3 cars connected by tiny brass hooks. The whole thing no longer than a man's hand, but perfect in its proportions and detail. He arranged these items carefully, creating order from the controlled chaos of work in progress. Each piece was positioned just so, each tool returned to its proper place. The chisels went in their rack, arranged by size. The small pots of paint were lined up according to color. The brushes stood in a jar, their handles down, their bristles clean and ready for use. This daily arranging was not merely tidiness for its own sake. It was a form of meditation, a way of preparing both the space and his own mind for the work ahead. As he worked, his eye fell upon a particular shelf near the back of the shop, slightly above his usual line of sight. On this shelf, among other toys that had accumulated over the years, stood a small wooden soldier. It was an old toy, very old, older than most of the pieces in the shop. The paint had faded until the soldier's red coat was more pink than scarlet, and his black boots had grayed with time. One arm was raised in a permanent salute, and his face, though simple, bore an expression of solemn dignity. Mr. Bellamy saw this soldier every morning as he tidied his workshop, and every morning he paused, just for a moment, his eyes resting on that small figure. He never moved it, never took it down to examine it, never offered it for sale, though customers occasionally inquired about the older toys on the upper shelves. It remained where it had been placed many years ago, and he could not have said exactly why he kept it there, could not have explained the small tightening in his chest when he looked at it, or the way his hand sometimes lifted slightly as if to reach for it before falling back to his side. This morning was no different. He paused, he looked, his expression grew distant for just a moment, and then he turned away and continued with his preparations. The shop was ready now, or nearly so. The floor was swept, the lamps were burning, the tools were arranged, the toys were in their places. Mr. Bellamy moved to the door and unlocked it, turning the key with a practiced twist, then pulled it open just slightly. He did not expect customers at this early hour. It was barely 6:30, but he liked to leave the door ajar, to allow the sounds of the street to enter, to signal that the shop was awake and alive, even if not yet fully open for business. Cold air entered with the morning sounds, carrying with it the scent of the market, vegetables and earth, the faint smell of fish from the fishmonger's stalls, bread baking somewhere nearby. Mr. Bellamy breathed it in, this particular perfume of Covent Garden, and felt the satisfaction of another day beginning, of continuity maintained. of work waiting to be done. He returned to his workbench and stood before it, his hands resting lightly on its scarred surface. The wood was dark with age and use, marked with the accumulated evidence of decades of labor knife cuts and chisel marks, stains from paint and varnish, small burns from soldering irons, depressions worn smooth where his hands habitually rested. It was a good workbench, solid and reliable, and he had known it all his life. For a moment, he simply stood there, listening to the sounds of the morning, feeling the warmth beginning to spread through the shop as the lamps worked against the cold, watching the gray light at the window gradually, almost imperceptibly, begin to brighten. There was no hurry. There was never any hurry. The work would be there, waiting patiently, and he would attend to it in due time, with care and attention, as he always had. Outside, London was waking fully now. The fog was beginning to lift, rising and thinning, revealing more of the street, more of the buildings, more of the people going about their business. The market sounds were louder, calls and laughter, the creak of barrow wheels, the lowing of cattle being driven to Smithfield. But inside the toy shop, all remained quiet and still, a small pocket of peace in the midst of the city's gathering energy. Mr. Bellamy picked up a piece of sandpaper and a small wooden horse head that he had carved the previous afternoon. He began to sand it gently, smoothing away the tiny imperfections, feeling the wood become silk beneath his fingers. The sound was soft, a gentle whisper of paper against wood, rhythmic and soothing. His breathing slowed to match the rhythm of his work. His mind grew quiet, focused entirely on the task at hand, on the feel of the wood, on the small adjustments required to perfect the curve of the horse's neck, the shape of its ears. And so the day began, as it always began, with lamplight and wood, and the patient work of hands that had known this labor for more than half a century. Outside, the world rushed and clamored and demanded. Inside, time moved differently, measured in the slow perfection of small things, in care given freely, in the quiet satisfaction of work done well. The fog continued to lift, and the morning light grew brighter, and Mr. Arthur Bellamy worked on in his small shop in Covent Garden, creating joy from wood and paint and imagination, as he had always done, as he would continue to do for as long as strength remained in his hands and sight in his eyes. The wooden soldier on its high shelf stood at eternal attention, bearing silent witness to another day beginning in the workshop where it had been made so many years ago, holding its memories close, waiting for whatever the day might bring, patient as only a toy can be, patient, content to simply be, to exist, to remember. And in that contentment, in that patient waiting, there was a kind of peace that filled the shop like lamplight, warm and gentle and complete. Part 2. Wood, paint, and gentle hands. The morning had settled into its working rhythm by the time Mr. Bellamy took up his carving knife. Outside, a gentle rain had begun to fall, so soft that it made almost no sound against the window glass, merely the faintest pattering, like small fingers tapping very lightly, very patiently. The rain would continue for hours, he thought, looking at the gray sky. It had that quality of permanence about it, that settled feeling of weather that had come to stay for the day. But inside the workshop, all was warm and dry. The lamps burned steadily, their light making the rain-darkened street seem even more distant, as if the shop existed in its own world, separate from the damp and gray outside. "Mister, Bellamy settled onto his work stool, a high seat worn smooth by decades of use, and drew the piece of wood toward him across the bench. It was a block of lime wood, pale and fine-grained, about the size of his fist. From this block, he intended to carve a doll's head. A simple thing, perhaps, to someone unfamiliar with the craft, but requiring considerable skill to execute well. The face must be smooth and symmetrical, the features delicate but clear, the expression gentle and welcoming. A child who received such a doll would look into that painted face countless times, would speak to it and confide in it, would carry it through the landscapes of childhood. The face must be worthy of that trust. He had selected his knife with care, a small blade with a curved edge, sharpened that very morning on the whetstone that lived in the drawer beneath his bench. The blade caught the lamplight as he turned it in his hand, testing its edge against his thumb with the practiced caution of one who had learned respect for sharp tools through long experience. Satisfied, he positioned the wood block in his left hand and brought the knife to its surface. The first cut was always a moment of commitment. Once the blade entered the wood, the block ceased to be pure potential and became, instead, a thing in process, a work begun that must be carried through to completion. Mr. Bellamy made this first cut with steady confidence, the blade sliding through the soft wood with a whisper of sound, curling up a thin ribbon of pale shaving that fell to the bench like a lock of hair. He worked slowly, methodically, turning the block in his hand, approaching it from different angles, removing wood in small amounts rather than large. The knife moved in short, controlled strokes, each one deliberate and sure. Gradually, the rough block began to reveal the sphere that lay hidden within it, the basic round shape that would become a head. The wood shavings accumulated on the bench before him, light and delicate, carrying the clean scent of fresh-cut lime. The sound of the knife against wood was rhythmic and soothing, a soft, shushing sound, repeated again and again, punctuated occasionally by the slight change in tone when the blade encountered a denser grain or a small knot. Mr. Bellamy's breathing fell into rhythm with his work, slow and even. His shoulders relaxed. His mind grew quiet, focused entirely on the feel of the wood, the angle of the blade, the emerging form beneath his hands. This was the part of his work he loved most, this quiet transformation of raw material into something purposeful and alive. His father had taught him this love, though perhaps taught was not quite the right word. One could not teach love. One could only demonstrate it, embody it, and hope that it would be caught like a benign contagion. He remembered his father's hands so clearly even after all these years, large hands, scarred and calloused, yet capable of remarkable delicacy. He remembered watching those hands carve a horse's head from a block of oak, the way they had moved with absolute certainty, never hesitating, the blade removing exactly the right amount of wood in exactly the right place. He had been perhaps 7 years old, sitting on a small stool in this very workshop, and he had thought his father must be a kind of magician to make such things appear from ordinary wood. "You must learn to see what is already there," his father had told him, not looking up from his work. "The horse is in the wood, waiting. Our job is only to reveal it, to remove what does not belong, to free what wishes to be seen." Mr. Bellamy had not understood this at the time, not truly. It had sounded like poetry, like something mystical and beyond the reach of a child. But he had taken up his own small knife, a blade his father had made safe for him by dulling its edge slightly. and he had begun to practice on scraps of wood, learning first to control the tool, to make it go where he wished it to go, to remove wood without removing fingers. The years of practice had been long, and there had been many failures, blocks of wood ruined by misplaced cuts, toys that emerged lopsided or awkward, fingers nicked and bandaged. But his father had been patient, had encouraged him to try again, had shown him how to read the grain of the wood, how to feel when the blade was cutting well and when it was fighting against the natural structure of the fibers. Wood has memory, his father had said. It remembers being a tree, remembers the wind and the rain, the seasons of its growth. If you work with this memory, it will cooperate. If you fight against it, it will resist. And gradually, through seasons and years, the wisdom in these words had revealed itself. The knife had become an extension of his hand. The wood had begun to speak to him in a language of texture and resistance. And the toys he made had begun to possess a quality he could not quite name but could recognize when he saw it. A kind of rightness, a sense of being exactly as they should be. The doll's head was taking shape now. The rough sphere had been refined, given the suggestion of a neck, the beginning of features. Mr. Bellamy set down his carving knife and took up a smaller tool, a tiny gouge no wider than a grain of rice, and began to work on the face. First, the eyes, shallow indentations, carefully placed, perfectly symmetrical. Then the nose, the merest suggestion of form, delicate as a whisper. Then the mouth, a simple curve, gentle and sweet. Each mark required complete attention. A slip of the tool, a moment of inattention, and the face would be spoiled. But Mr. Bellamy's hand was steady, guided by years of practice and an instinct that had become almost unconscious. The features emerged slowly, each one considered and reconsidered, tested against his inner vision of what the face should be. When the carving was complete, he held the small head up to the lamp, turning it slowly, examining it from all angles. The wood was smooth under his fingers, warm from his handling. The face looked back at him with blank, unpainted eyes, waiting to be given color and life. He was satisfied. Tomorrow he would sand it until it was silk smooth, and then it would be ready for painting. He set the carved head aside and reached for another piece of wood. This one darker, a piece of cherry that would become the body of a small horse. But before beginning this new work, he paused to clean his carving knife, wiping the blade carefully with a soft cloth, removing the fine dust of lime wood that had accumulated along its edge. The knife was returned to its place in the wooden rack, where his tools lived, each one in its designated slot, arranged by size and purpose. The rain continued its gentle drumming against the window. Somewhere outside, a cart rumbled past, its wheels splashing through puddles. Voices called to one another in the market, though the words were too muffled by rain and distance to distinguish. These sounds formed a soft background to the silence of the workshop, a reminder that the world continued its business beyond these walls, while inside, time moved according to different measures. Mr. Bellamy took up a different tool now, a rasp, for the cherry wood was harder than lime and required more aggressive removal of material in the initial stages. The rasp made a different sound than the knife, a rougher, more insistent scraping, and it produced coarser shavings that fell to the bench in small chips rather than delicate curls. The work was more vigorous, requiring more force, and Mr. Bellamy shifted his position on the stool, bracing the wood against the bench, applying pressure in steady, rhythmic strokes. The scent of the cherry wood was different too, sweeter, richer, with a faint undertone of something almost spicy. Mr. Bellamy breathed it in, appreciating the particular character of this wood, the way it felt different under the tool, the way it held detail differently than pine or lime or oak. Each wood had its own personality, its own strengths and limitations, and part of his craft was knowing which wood to choose for which purpose. Cherry was good for horses, for the dark reddish-brown of the wood itself suggested the color of a bay horse's coat and required less paint to achieve a natural appearance. It was hard enough to withstand the rough play of children, yet fine-grained enough to hold detail well. A horse carved in cherry, properly finished, would last for generations, might be passed down from parent to child, accumulating the invisible patina of handling, the smooth wear that came from being loved. As he worked, his mind wandered through memories of horses he had carved over the years. There had been hundreds of them. Rocking horses large and small, pull toys with wheels, individual horses to go with toy farms or cavalry sets, each one slightly different, for he could never quite bring himself to create exact duplicates. Even when making a set, he would vary some small detail, the angle of the head, the position of the legs, the expression in the carved features. His father had made horses too, and his grandfather before him. There was a tradition in the family, a particular way of shaping the curve of the neck, of positioning the ears, of suggesting the musculature of the haunches. Mr. Bellamy had learned this tradition and had added his own refinements to it. And now, when he carved a horse, it was both an act of creation and an act of connection to those who had come before him, whose hands had held these same tools, had shaped this same form from wood and patience. The morning wore on, measured in the gradual accumulation of wood shavings on the bench, the slow transformation of rough blocks into recognizable forms. Mr. Bellamy worked without hurrying, stopping occasionally to examine his progress, to test an edge with his finger, to hold a piece up to the light and consider whether it required more work or was ready to move to the next stage of completion. At some point, he could not have said exactly when, he became aware that his hands were growing slightly tired, that his shoulders were beginning to stiffen from maintaining the same posture for so long. He set down his tools and stood, stretching carefully, feeling his spine realign itself. His muscles released their tension. The rain had intensified slightly, and the light from outside had darkened further, making the workshop's lamps seem brighter by contrast. He moved to the small spirit stove in the corner and put on the kettle for tea. While the water heated, he walked slowly about the shop, touching things, examining the work on various shelves, allowing his body to rest from the concentrated stillness of carving. His fingers trailed across the smooth surface of a finished rocking horse, felt the texture of a cloth doll's dress, tested the mechanism of a wind-up toy to ensure it moved freely. The kettle began to sing, and he prepared his tea, the familiar ritual of warming the pot, measuring the leaves, pouring the water, waiting for it to steep. The scent of the tea mingled with the smell of wood and varnish and paint, creating a combination that was, to him, the very essence of comfort and home. He poured the tea into a white china cup and stood by the window, looking out at the rain-dark street, at the people hurrying past under umbrellas, at the gray stone and wet pavement. How many such mornings had he spent here, standing in this exact spot, looking out this same window? Thousands, certainly. The view had changed over the years. New shops had opened and old ones closed. Buildings had been renovated or allowed to decline. Fashions had changed. Vehicles had evolved. But the essential character of the street remained constant. And the rhythm of his days remained constant. And there was comfort in that constancy, a kind of peace that came from knowing one's place and being content with it. He finished his tea and returned to his workbench, ready to continue. The cherry wood horse was taking shape, the rough form now visible, requiring only refinement and detail. He took up his smaller knives and began the careful work of shaping the head, the legs, the flowing tail. His hands moved with the certainty of long practice, the blade finding its way almost of its own accord, guided by knowledge that lived in muscle and bone rather than conscious thought. And so the morning passed into afternoon. The rain continued its gentle falling. The lamps burned steadily, and Mr. Arthur Bellamy worked on in his small shop, his hands bringing forth from wood the forms of horses and dolls, soldiers and bears, all the small companions of childhood, creating them with care and patience and love, as his father had done, as he had been doing all his life, as he would continue to do for as long as strength remained and skill endured. The world outside moved at its frantic pace, but here, in this quiet workshop, time moved differently, slowly, peacefully, measured in the rhythm of blade against wood, in the accumulation of shavings, in the gradual revelation of form from formlessness, in the patient transformation of ordinary materials into small vessels of joy. Part 3. A familiar face at the door. The afternoon had deepened by the time Mr. Bellamy heard the soft tapping at his door. The rain had eased to a fine mist that hung in the air like gauze, and the street outside had taken on that particular quietness that comes when weather has driven most people indoors, and only the most determined souls venture out. The lamps in the workshop glowed warmly against the gray afternoon light, making the space feel especially sheltered and safe. Mr. Bellamy looked up from the toy he was painting, a small wooden duck, bright yellow, with an orange beak, and set down his brush carefully before rising to answer the door. He moved slowly, as always, giving his knees time to adjust to the change from sitting to standing, and crossed the workshop with measured steps. At the door stood a woman of perhaps 60 years, dressed in a dark wool coat that was damp from the mist, carrying a woven basket covered with a checkered cloth. Her face was familiar and dear to him, weathered by time but kind, with eyes that held the warmth of long friendship. This was Mrs. Catherine Hartley, who kept a small bakery 3 doors down from his shop, and who had been his neighbor for more years than either of them could easily count. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Hartley," Mr. Bellamy said, stepping back to allow her entrance. "Please, do come in from the damp. You will catch your death walking about in such weather." "Good afternoon, Mr. Bellamy," she replied, her voice soft and carrying the accent of one who had been born in this very neighborhood and had never seen reason to leave it. "I do not mind a bit of mist, you know, but I confess I am glad of your warm shop. It is quite chill out there." She stepped inside, and Mr. Bellamy closed the door behind her, shutting out the gray afternoon. "I have brought you something," Mrs. Hartley said, setting her basket on the small table near the door and drawing back the cloth to reveal 2 currant buns, still faintly steaming, their tops glazed and glistening. "Fresh from the oven not 20 minutes ago. I thought you might like one with your afternoon tea." Bellamy felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the shop. "You are too kind, Mrs. Hartley, far too kind. You bring me baked goods every week, and I have nothing to offer you in return." "Nonsense," she said firmly but gently. "You have mended toys for my grandchildren more times than I can count, and never once have you charged me the full worth of your labor. We are neighbors, Mr. Bellamy, and neighbors look after one another." That is simply how things are done. She removed her damp coat, and Mr. Bellamy hung it near the fire where it would dry. Then he set about preparing tea for both of them, an activity that required several minutes of comfortable silence, the filling of the kettle, the arranging of cups and saucers, the selection of tea leaves from his small tin caddy. Mrs. Hartley wandered about the shop as he worked, examining the toys on the shelves with the interest of one who genuinely appreciated the craft that went into them. "This rocking horse is new," she observed, running her hand along the smooth curve of its back. "You have finished it beautifully. The mane looks so real, I almost expect it to move in a breeze." "It is real horsehair," Mr. Bellamy said, warming the teapot, "from a mare that belonged to the coal merchant. When she died last month, he asked if I would like the tail, knowing I use it for my horses. I was able to get enough hair for 3 or 4 toys. It makes all the difference in the appearance, I think." "Indeed it does," Mrs. Hartley agreed. "A child who receives this will treasure it, I am certain." "Who has commissioned it?" "A family in Bloomsbury," Mr. Bellamy said. "Their daughter is turning 6, and they wanted something special for her birthday. I have been working on it for the better part of a month. The carving, the painting, the varnishing, all the small details. It will be collected tomorrow." The tea was ready, and they settled into the 2 chairs that stood near the fire. Mr. Bellamy's usual working stool was too uncomfortable for sitting at leisure, so he kept these chairs for the rare occasions when he had visitors who stayed more than a few minutes. Mrs. Hartley accepted her cup with a small nod of thanks and took one of the currant buns from the basket, placing it on a napkin on her lap. "Do try the bun," she urged. "I have been experimenting with the amount of currants, and I think I have got it right at last. Enough to give flavor, but not so many that the dough becomes heavy." Mr. Bellamy took a bite and found it excellent, light and slightly sweet. The currants distributed evenly throughout, the glaze adding just the right touch of richness. "It is perfect," he said. "Truly perfect. You have always had a gift for baking, Mrs. Hartley, but I believe your skill continues to improve even now." She smiled, pleased. "One never stops learning, I suppose. Even at our age, every batch of bread teaches me something new, if I am paying attention. It is much like your toys, I imagine, each one unique, each one an opportunity to refine your craft." They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, sipping their tea, listening to the rain that had begun again, a bit heavier now, drumming softly against the window glass. The fire crackled gently in the grate, and the lamps cast their warm light across the workshop, illuminating the rows of toys on their shelves. Soldiers and dolls, animals and vehicles, puzzles and games, all waiting patiently for children to claim them and bring them to life through play. "I was remembering this morning," Mrs. Hartley said after a time, "how my oldest grandson, young William, you recall, used to come into your shop when he was small. He could not have been more than 4 or 5. He would stand at the window for ages, just looking at the toys, his nose pressed to the glass, and you always invited him in, even when his mother and I were busy at the bakery and could not accompany him." Mr. Bellamy nodded, remembering. "William, yes, of course. A serious child, very thoughtful. He particularly loved the toy theater, as I recall. He would ask me to demonstrate how the curtains worked, how the little figures could be moved about on the stage. I must have shown him a dozen times, and each time he watched with the same intensity, as if he were witnessing magic." "He is 17 now," Mrs. Hartley said, her voice touched with the melancholy that comes from watching children grow and change. "A clerk in a shipping office. He wears a collar and tie and carries papers about. When I see him now, I can hardly believe he is the same child who stood at your window dreaming about toys. They all grow up, Mr. Bellamy said gently. It is the way of things, but I like to think that something remains from those early years, some memory of wonder that they carry with them even into adulthood. The toys we loved as children, they stay with us somehow, do they not? Not the physical objects, perhaps, but the feeling of them, the joy they brought. Do you remember your own toys? Mrs. Hartley asked. From when you were a child? Bellamy smiled, his gaze growing distant. I do, though it was a very long time ago. My father made most of my toys, of course. There was a wooden train, I remember, painted green and black, with 3 cars that hooked together, and a top that spun when you pressed down on the handle. I would watch it for what seemed like hours, mesmerized by the way the painted colors blurred together when it spun. But the toy I loved most was a small wooden soldier that my father carved for me when I was perhaps 6 years old. It was very simple, nothing like the elaborate soldiers I make now. But to me, it was perfect. I carried it everywhere, told it stories, made it the hero of countless imaginary battles. His voice had grown very soft, and Mrs. Hartley looked at him with gentle understanding. Do you still have this soldier? She asked quietly. Mr. Bellamy hesitated, then nodded almost imperceptibly. I do. It is here in the shop, in fact, on that shelf there, the high one near the back. I see it every day, though I rarely take it down. It has become rather fragile with age, and I would not wish to damage it. Hartley followed his gaze to the shelf he indicated and saw the small, faded figure standing at attention among other older toys. It must be precious to you, she said. It is a connection, Mr. Bellamy said, to my father, to my childhood, to the time when the world was new and full of possibility. My father made it with his own hands, carved it from a piece of pine, painted it as carefully as he would have painted a toy for a customer. He gave it to me not because it was my birthday or Christmas, but simply because he thought I might like it. I remember the day so clearly, a summer afternoon, much like any other, and he called me into the workshop and presented it to me, wrapped in a scrap of paper. Such a small thing, and yet it has stayed with me all my life. They sat quietly for a time, both of them thinking about the strange power of objects to hold memory, to serve as anchors to the past. Outside, the afternoon was fading toward evening, the gray light growing dimmer, the street sounds becoming fewer as people hurried home to their suppers and their fires. The children who receive your toys, Mrs. Hartley said, they are very fortunate. You put something of yourself into each one, I think. They are not merely objects to you. They are small gifts of love, crafted with care and patience. That is a rare thing in this world that seems always to be rushing, always seeking the quickest and cheapest way to make and sell things. I work as I was taught to work, Mr. Bellamy said. My father believed that anything worth doing was worth doing well, that craft matters, that quality endures. I am too old now to change my ways, even if I wish to, and I do not wish to. There is satisfaction in making things properly, in knowing that a toy I create today might still be giving joy 50 years hence, might be passed from one generation to the next. Mrs. Hartley finished her tea and set down her cup with a gentle clink of china against saucer. I should be going, she said. The shop will be closing soon, and I have bread to set for tomorrow's baking. But it has been lovely to sit with you for a while, Mr. Bellamy. These quiet conversations are becoming more precious to me as I grow older. So many of the people I knew in my youth are gone now, and it is a comfort to have neighbors who remember the old days, who understand the value of taking time, of doing things well. Bellamy rose and helped her with her coat, which had dried near the fire and was now warm and slightly stiff. "You are welcome here any time, Mrs. Hartley," he said. "Your visits are always a pleasure, and your baked goods are far superior to anything I could purchase." She smiled and collected her basket, leaving one of the currant buns behind for his supper. "I shall see you soon then. Take care of yourself, Mr. Bellamy. These damp days are hard on old bones. And you as well, Mrs. Hartley. Mind the puddles on your way home." He watched from the doorway as she made her way down the street, her figure gradually fading into the mist and the gathering dusk. Then he closed the door and turned back to his workshop, feeling warmed not only by the tea and the fire, but by the gentle comfort of friendship, by the knowledge that he was not entirely alone in the world, that there were those who valued him and whom he valued in return. He returned to his workbench and took up the yellow duck once more, examining the paint he had applied before Mrs. Hartley's arrival. It had dried well, the color bright and cheerful. Tomorrow he would add the details, the eyes, the suggestion of feathers, perhaps a small pattern on the wings. But for now, he was content to simply hold it, to appreciate the smoothness of the wood beneath the paint, to imagine some child delighting in this simple toy, pushing it across the floor, quacking along with it, creating stories and adventures from nothing more than a bit of carved and painted wood. The lamps burned steadily, the fire settled into its evening rhythm, and Mr. Arthur Bellamy worked on in his small shop, surrounded by the fruits of his labor, holding close the warmth of friendship and memory. As the afternoon faded into evening and the world outside grew dark and quiet. Part 4. The Child and the Wooden Toy. The following morning arrived with clearer skies, though the air remained cold and damp from the previous day's rain. Mr. Bellamy had opened his shop at the usual hour, had lit his lamps and swept his floor, had settled into the familiar rhythm of his work. He was painting the details on the yellow duck, tiny black eyes, the suggestion of feathers along the wings, when he became aware of a small presence at his door. Looking up, he saw a child standing just outside the threshold, peering in with wide, uncertain eyes. The child was perhaps 7 or 8 years old, difficult to say exactly, wearing clothing that had been mended many times and a cap that was slightly too large, suggesting it had been handed down from an older sibling. The child's face was thin but clean, and there was something in the expression, a mixture of hope and apprehension, that touched Mr. Bellamy's heart immediately. He set down his paintbrush and rose from his stool, moving slowly so as not to startle the child. "Good morning," he said gently, keeping his voice soft and welcoming. "Are you looking for something in particular, or would you like to come in and look at the toys?" The child took one hesitant step forward, then stopped, clearly torn between desire and uncertainty. "Please, sir," came a small voice. A girl's voice, Mr. Bellamy realized. "I was wondering, that is, I wanted to ask." She trailed off, her courage apparently failing her. "Come in, please," Mr. Bellamy said, stepping back and gesturing into the shop. "It is too cold to stand about in doorways. Come in where it is warm, and you can tell me what you need." The girl entered slowly, her eyes growing wide as she took in the shelves of toys surrounding her on all sides. She turned in a slow circle, looking up and around, clearly overwhelmed by the abundance of carved and painted wonders. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and she seemed almost afraid to move, as if worried that she might accidentally damage something. Have you been to my shop before?" "Mr. Bellamy asked, returning to his work stool but remaining attentive to his small visitor. The girl shook her head. "No, sir, but I have looked in the window many times. When my mother sends me to the market for vegetables, I always walk this way so I can see the toys. They are very beautiful, sir." "That is kind of you to say," Mr. Bellamy replied. "What is your name, my dear?" "Annie, sir." "Annie Fletcher." "Well, Miss Annie Fletcher, I am Mr. Bellamy, and I am very pleased to make your acquaintance. Now, you were about to ask me something when you were at the door. What was it you wished to know?" Annie's hands twisted together nervously. "I wanted to know, sir, how much a toy would cost. Just a small toy, nothing fine. Only, I have been saving my pennies, and I thought perhaps I might have enough." Mr. Bellamy regarded her with gentle attention. "That depends on the toy, of course. Different toys cost different amounts. But tell me, is this toy for yourself or for someone else?" "For my brother, sir," Annie said, her voice becoming slightly stronger now that she was speaking of her purpose. "He is only 4, and he has been poorly this winter. A cough that will not leave him. The doctor says he must stay indoors and rest, but he gets so restless and unhappy. I thought if he had a toy, something to play with and imagine with, it might help him pass the time more cheerfully." "I see," Mr. Bellamy said, nodding slowly. "That is very thoughtful of you, to think of your brother's happiness. What sort of toy were you considering?" Annie looked around at the shelves, clearly overwhelmed by the choices. "I do not know, sir. Something simple that he could hold in his hands and carry about. He likes animals especially. We saw a horse once when we went to the country to visit our aunt, and he talked of it for weeks afterward." Bellamy rose and moved to one of the shelves, considering the various toys displayed there. "How many pennies have you managed to save?" he asked. Annie reached into her pocket and produced a small cloth purse, which she opened carefully. She counted the coins onto her palm. 7 pence, sir," she said, a note of pride in her voice. "I have been saving for 2 months. I help the greengrocer's wife on Saturday mornings, carrying bundles for the customers, and she gives me 2 pence each time. And I found a penny in the street once, 7 pence. It was not very much, Mr. Bellamy knew. Most of his toys sold for considerably more. The simpler ones for a shilling or 18 pence, the more elaborate ones for several shillings or even more. But he also knew what it meant for a child to save 2 pence at a time, to guard those coins carefully and resist the temptation to spend them on sweets or small treats. He scanned the shelves, looking for something appropriate. His eye fell on a small carved horse that he had made some weeks earlier. It was a simple piece, carved from pine, painted brown with a black mane and tail, standing perhaps 4 inches high. He had made it as a practice piece while working out the proportions for a larger commission. And it had no particular destination. The work was good, the proportions were correct, but it was indeed simple compared to some of his more elaborate pieces. He took it down and examined it, turning it in his hands. Yes, this would do nicely. It was small enough for a young child to hold easily, sturdy enough to withstand rough play, and the workmanship was sound even if the design was plain. "What about this?" he asked, showing it to Annie. "Do you think your brother might like it?" Annie's face transformed, lighting with delight. She reached out tentatively, and Mr. Bellamy placed the horse in her hands. She held it carefully, reverently, examining it from all angles. "Oh," she breathed, "it is perfect, sir. It is exactly like the horse we saw. He will love it. I know he will. But Her expression fell slightly. "How much does it cost, sir?" Mr. Bellamy appeared to consider the question carefully, though in truth, he had already made his decision. "Well," he said slowly, "it is a simple piece, as you can see. Not as elaborate as some of my work. I should think 7 pence would be a fair price for such a toy." Annie's eyes widened. "Truly, sir? You would sell it for exactly what I have?" "I would indeed," Mr. Bellamy said. "It seems to me that a toy is worth exactly what someone is willing to pay for it. And you have clearly worked hard to save your 7 pence. That makes the horse worth precisely that amount." Annie's eyes had become bright with tears that she was clearly fighting to hold back. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you so very much. You are very kind." She counted out her 7 coins onto the workbench, placing each one carefully as if it were something precious. Mr. Bellamy accepted them and placed them in his cash box, then took a piece of brown paper and wrapped the horse carefully, tying it with string. "There," he said, handing her the package. "That should keep it safe on your journey home. Give your brother my best wishes for a swift recovery, and tell him that this horse is very brave and will go on many adventures with him." Annie clutched the package to her chest, her face glowing with happiness. "I will, sir. I will tell him he is going to be so pleased. He has been so sad, lying in bed day after day. This will cheer him. I know it will." She moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. "Sir, you are the kindest man I have ever met. When I am grown and have money of my own, I shall come back and buy more toys from you, the finest ones you have, and I shall give them to children who need them. I promise." Mr. Bellamy felt a warmth spread through his chest, a tightness in his throat. "That is a fine ambition, Miss Fletcher. I hope you will be able to fulfill it. But for now, hurry home to your brother. The day is cold, and you should not be out longer than necessary." Annie nodded and slipped out the door, but not before favoring him with one more brilliant smile. He watched through the window as she walked away down the street, the wrapped package held carefully in both hands, her step considerably lighter than it had been when she arrived. When she had disappeared around the corner, Mr. Bellamy returned to his workbench and opened the cash box, looking at the 7 pennies Annie had given him. They represented 2 months of Saturday morning labor, of carrying bundles and being patient with demanding customers, of resisting the temptation to spend the slowly accumulating coins. They represented a sister's love for her ailing brother, a desire to bring comfort and joy to someone who was suffering. He closed the cash box and returned to his painting, but his mind was not on the yellow duck before him. He was thinking, instead of a small boy lying in bed, coughing and restless and unhappy, and of the moment when his sister would return home and present him with the wrapped package, of the joy that would light his face when he unwrapped it and saw the little brown horse, of the adventures they would have together, galloping across the blankets, jumping over pillows, racing to imaginary destinations. The horse had cost Mr. Bellamy perhaps an hour of his time to carve and paint, and the materials were worth only a few pennies at most. But to that boy, to his sister, it would be worth considerably more. It would be a companion, a spark for imagination, a small bright point of happiness in what had been a difficult winter. This was why he made toys, Mr. Bellamy thought. Not for the money, though he needed to earn enough to live. Not for the recognition, though it was pleasant when his work was appreciated. He made toys because they mattered, because they brought joy to children, because they opened doorways to imaginary worlds where anything was possible, where small boys could be brave riders and little girls could be fairy queens, where the ordinary constraints of life fell away and wonder took their place. His father had understood this. We are not merely making objects, his father had told him long ago. We are making possibilities. We are making dreams that children can hold in their hands. At the time, Mr. Bellamy had been young and had not fully grasped the depth of this statement. But now, after a lifetime of making toys, of seeing the faces of children light up with joy, of hearing reports of imaginary adventures in make-believe worlds, he understood. Each toy was a small gift of possibility, a key that unlocked imagination, a companion for the long journey of childhood. The morning wore on, and Mr. Bellamy returned to his work with renewed purpose. He finished the yellow duck and set it aside to dry, then began work on a new project, a simple doll carved from basswood. As he worked, his hands moving with practiced certainty, he found himself humming quietly a tune from his own childhood that he could not remember learning, but which seemed to live in his bones. Outside, the day brightened slightly, the clouds thinning enough to allow pale sunlight to filter through. The market sounds continued their familiar rhythm, voices calling, cartwheels rumbling, the general murmur of commerce and human activity. But inside the toy shop, all was peaceful and warm, filled with the quiet satisfaction of work well done and kindness freely given. Mr. Bellamy thought of Annie Fletcher walking home through the cold streets, clutching her precious package, hurrying to reach her brother and share the joy she had found. He hoped the little horse would bring the comfort she sought, hoped the boy's cough would ease and his strength would return, hoped that somewhere in the future, a grown woman named Annie would remember this day and keep her promise to bring toys and happiness to other children in need. It was a good hope, a gentle hope, and it warmed him more thoroughly than any fire as he bent to his work, his hands bringing forth from simple wood the small companions of childhood, the vessels of imagination, the quiet gifts of love. The afternoon found Mr. Bellamy engaged in a task he had been postponing for some weeks, the sorting and reorganizing of the upper shelves at the back of his workshop. These shelves held an accumulation of years, perhaps decades, toys that had been set aside for various reasons, pieces that had never been sold, experiments in design that had not quite succeeded, and occasionally items that customers had commissioned but never collected. It was not that the shelves were disorderly, exactly. Mr. Bellamy was too meticulous in his habits to allow true disorder to take hold, but things had gradually become jumbled, pushed back to make room for newer pieces, and he had reached the point where he could no longer easily see what resided in the deeper recesses of the shelves. It was time he had decided this morning to take everything down, dust it properly, and return it to its place with better organization. He had positioned his tall wooden ladder, a sturdy thing that had belonged to his father and possibly his grandfather before that, against the shelves and begun the slow work of removing items one by one. Each toy had to be handled carefully, examined for any damage that might have occurred during its time on the shelf, dusted with a soft cloth, and either set aside for restoration or deemed fit to return to its place. The work was slow but not unpleasant. There was something meditative about it, something that allowed his mind to wander through memories as his hands performed their careful labor. Each toy he brought down carried with it some association, a particular commission he remembered, a technique he had been practicing. A season of his life now long past. He had worked his way through 2 shelves and was reaching toward the back of the 3rd when his fingers encountered something unexpected, a soft texture quite different from the smooth wood of most of his toys. Curious, he He stretched a bit further, grasped the object, and carefully drew it forward into the light. It was a small cloth doll, perhaps 10 inches tall, dressed in a faded blue dress with a white apron. The doll's face was painted on muslin, simple features, gentle and sweet, though the paint had cracked in places and faded from its original brightness. The hair was made of brown yarn, still present but somewhat tangled, and the dress, though clean, showed the wear of much handling. The fabric was thin in places, and one seam along the side had begun to separate. Mr. Bellamy descended the ladder carefully, holding the doll, and brought it to his workbench where the light was better. He turned it slowly in his hands, examining it from all angles. The doll was old, that much was immediately apparent, but it was not one of his own making. The stitching was different from his usual method, and the face was painted in a style he had not used in many years, if ever, and yet it was familiar somehow. He had seen this doll before, had held it in his hands at some point in the past, but when and why had it been placed on that upper shelf, pushed back where it would not ordinarily be seen or remembered? He set the doll on the bench and stood looking at it, trying to coax the memory forward. The doll looked back at him with its painted eyes, patient and serene, carrying within its worn fabric and faded paint the evidence of a history he could not quite recall. On the doll's back, he noticed there was a small patch of different fabric, a repair that someone had made with considerable care. The stitches tiny and even. He examined this repair more closely and saw that beneath it, embroidered in thread that was now brown with age, were initials, M.T. He turned the letters over in his mind, searching for a connection. Margaret? Mary? Martha? Thomas? Thompson? The initials were familiar, tantalizingly so, hovering just at the edge of recollection, like a face half seen in fog. Mr. Bellamy carried the doll to his comfortable chair near the fire and settled into it, still holding the toy, still trying to remember. The workshop was quiet save for the soft ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece and the occasional settling of coals in the grate. Outside, the afternoon sounds of the market continued, but they seemed very distant, as if they belonged to a different world entirely. He closed his eyes and let his mind drift backward through the years, not forcing the memory, but allowing it to surface naturally if it would. There had been so many customers over the decades, so many children and parents and grandparents, so many toys made and sold and sent out into the world. How could he be expected to remember every single one? And yet, this doll seemed important somehow, seemed to carry with it a significance that went beyond its modest appearance. The wear on the fabric suggested it had been much loved, much handled. Someone had cared for this doll enough to make that careful repair, to embroider those initials, to preserve it even as it aged and faded. Mr. Bellamy opened his eyes and looked again at the doll's face. The painted features were simple: 2 dots for eyes, a small curved line for a mouth, a mere suggestion of a nose. And yet there was something in the expression, some quality of gentleness and kindness that touched him. Whoever had made this doll, they had understood something essential about toys for children, that they must be approachable, must seem friendly rather than formal, must invite affection rather than mere admiration. He turned the doll over again, examining every detail. The dress had been made with care, despite its simplicity. The tiny buttons on the back were real buttons, not merely painted suggestions. The apron had a small pocket stitched to the front, a detail that served no practical purpose, but which added character to the piece. The shoes were painted directly onto the muslin feet, simple black shapes, but precisely rendered. Gradually, as he sat there in the quietness of the afternoon, surrounded by the comfortable familiarity of his workshop, a memory began to emerge. Not complete, not yet, but fragmentary impressions rather than a coherent narrative. A request for a repair. Something about a granddaughter. The doll being placed on his workbench, lying there much as it lay now in his hands, waiting for his attention. He concentrated, trying to bring the memory into sharper focus. Yes, there had been a woman, elderly, dressed in black as if in mourning. She had brought the doll to him and asked if he could repair it. The dress had been torn and some of the yarn hair had come loose. She had been apologetic about the state of the doll, had explained that it had been her daughter's favorite toy many years ago, and now her granddaughter had inherited it and loved it just as much. Mary, the woman had said, "My daughter was Mary, and now my granddaughter is called Mary as well, after her." The doll has been Mary's companion through 2 generations. I know it is not a valuable piece, Mr. Bellamy, but it is precious to us. Could you restore it, do you think? Bellamy sat very still, the memory crystallizing. Yes, he had taken the doll and had repaired it, had mended the torn dress, had resecured the loose yarn, had touched up the faded paint on the face. He had done the work carefully, with full attention, treating the old doll with the same respect he would have given a much finer piece, because he had understood that its value lay not in its monetary worth, but in its history, in the love it had received and continued to receive. And when the woman had returned to collect it, she had been so pleased, so grateful. She had insisted on paying him more than he had asked, though he had protested that the work had been simple and had required only an hour or 2 of his time. "My granddaughter will be so happy," the woman had said, tears in her eyes. "This doll is her dearest friend. She takes it everywhere, tells it all her secrets. It was breaking my heart to see it falling to pieces. You have given us such a gift, Mr. Bellamy." But then, what had happened? Why was the doll here in his workshop rather than with the granddaughter who loved it? Mr. Bellamy frowned, trying to remember. The woman had taken the doll when she left. He was certain of that. He could remember wrapping it carefully in brown paper, handing it to her, watching her smile as she held the package. And yet, here it was, years later, discovered on a dusty shelf in the back of his workshop. He rose and went to the small desk where he kept his account books, ledgers recording every commission, every repair, every sale going back decades. He found the volume that covered the period his memory suggested, perhaps 15 or 20 years ago, and began to page through it, looking for any mention of a doll repair, any notation that might illuminate this mystery. There, an entry from April of 1868, nearly 25 years ago. Repair of cloth doll, requested by Mrs. Millicent Thornton. Mending of dress, re-securing of hair, touching up of paint. Fee, 1 shilling, paid upon collection. Mrs. Millicent Thornton, M.T., the initials on the doll's back. So the doll had belonged not to the daughter or granddaughter, but to Mrs. Thornton herself, and she had embroidered her own initials there, marking it as hers. But that still did not explain why the doll was here. The ledger clearly indicated that Mrs. Thornton had collected and paid for the repair. Unless Mr. Bellamy turned the page and found another entry dated several weeks later. Mrs. Thornton returned. Brings doll again. Granddaughter has passed away. Asks if I might keep the doll here. cannot bear to see it. No charge. The granddaughter, the second Mary, had died, and Mrs. Thornton, in her grief, had been unable to keep the doll that had been her granddaughter's companion. She had brought it back to him, asked him to keep it, and he, understanding something of grief and loss, had agreed. He must have placed it on that upper shelf, meaning to find a proper place for it later. And then the years had passed, and he had forgotten, and the doll had remained there, waiting patiently in the darkness. Holding its memories close, Mr. Bellamy sat down slowly, still holding the doll, feeling a great sadness wash over him. 2 generations of Marys, the mother who had died and the granddaughter who had followed her too soon. And this small cloth doll, passed from one to the other, had been witness to both their lives and both their deaths, had been loved by both, had provided comfort to both. And now it was here, in his hands, still patient, still gentle, still holding in its worn fabric all those years of love and loss. He looked at the doll's painted face and thought about the impermanence of life, about how people passed through this world so briefly, while the objects they loved might endure long after they were gone. This doll had outlasted both the Marys who had loved it. It might outlast Mrs. Thornton as well, if she still lived. It might outlast him, Mr. Bellamy, sitting here in his workshop, contemplating the strange persistence of things. But there was comfort in that persistence too, he thought. The doll carried within it the love it had received. It was not merely cloth and paint and yarn. It was a repository of affection, a witness to tenderness, a small monument to the fact that these 2 girls had lived and had been loved, even if their time had been brief. Mr. Bellamy rose and moved to the shelf where his own childhood soldiers stood at attention. Carefully, gently, he placed the cloth doll beside the soldier, 2 old toys standing together, 2 small vessels of memory, keeping each other company. "There," he said softly, though there was no one to hear him. "You need not be alone in the darkness any longer." The afternoon light was fading now, the workshop growing dimmer. Mr. Bellamy lit another lamp and returned to his reorganizing, but his movements were slower now, more thoughtful. Each toy he handled seemed to carry its own story, its own history, and he treated each one with new reverence, understanding more fully than ever before that he was not merely a maker of toys, but a keeper of memories, a guardian of small objects that held within them the joys and sorrows of those who had loved them. The work continued into the early evening, quiet and meditative. While outside the market closed for the day and the streets grew gradually quieter, and the doll and the soldier stood together on their shelf, 2 old friends reunited, bearing witness to the gentle passage of time. Part 6. Stories Carved in Wood. The discovery of the cloth doll had stirred something in Mr. Bellamy's mind, and in the days that followed, he found himself thinking often about the lives of toys, not their physical existence, but the invisible histories they carried, the stories they witnessed, the affections they absorbed and held within themselves like vessels holding water. It was a gray morning, some 3 days after he had found the doll, and Mr. Bellamy sat at his workbench, not working but simply sitting, his hands resting quietly on the scarred wood surface, his mind wandering through thoughts that felt both melancholy and strangely peaceful. The shop was not yet fully open. The door remained closed, the lamps burned low, and he had allowed himself this quiet time to think, to remember, to contemplate the nature of the work to which he had devoted his life. He looked around at the shelves that lined his workshop, at the hundreds of toys that waited there in various stages of completion or readiness for sale. Each one, he thought, would eventually find its way into the hands of a child. Each one would become part of someone's story, someone's childhood, someone's memories. Some of these toys would be treasured, would be carried everywhere, would be confided in and cared for and loved with the fierce devotion that children bring to their favorite possessions. Others would be played with casually, enjoyed, but not particularly cherished, and eventually forgotten or passed along to younger siblings, or discarded when the child grew older and put away childish things. And a very few, like the cloth doll that now stood beside his childhood soldier on the upper shelf, would transcend their simple material nature and become something more. Repositories of love, so deep that they could not be parted with even in grief. Witnesses to lives lived and lost, small anchors of memory in the rushing stream of time. Mr. Bellamy rose and went to stand before the shelf where the doll and the soldier kept their patient vigil. He did not touch them, merely stood looking at them, these two old toys that had outlasted so much, that had endured while the children who loved them had grown or died, while the world had changed around them. His soldier, carved by his father's hands more than 60 years ago, painted in colors that had faded from bright to muted, one arm raised in perpetual salute. What memories did it hold? It had been witness to his entire childhood, had been present for both joys and sorrows, had been clutched in small hands during illnesses, and carried in pockets during explorations of the neighborhood. It had been there the day his father taught him to carve his first piece of wood, had been there the night his mother died, had been there through all the seasons of his growing up. And now it stood here, a silent witness to his old age, to his continuing work in this same workshop where it had been created. If it could speak, what stories would it tell? What would it say about the boy who had carried it everywhere, who had made it the hero of countless imaginary adventures, who had eventually grown into a man and become a maker of toys himself, creating for other children the same kinds of companions he himself had treasured? The cloth doll beside it held different stories, stories Mr. Bellamy could only partly know. It had belonged to a woman named Millicent Thornton, had been passed to her daughter Mary, and then to her granddaughter, also Mary. 3 generations of hands had held it. 3 sets of eyes had looked into its painted face. 3 hearts had opened to it in trust and affection. The first Mary, the mother, would have been born perhaps in the 1820s or 1830s. Mr. Bellamy could not be certain of the dates. She would have grown up in a world different from the one he now inhabited, a world without railways or telegraphs, a world where London was smaller and the countryside came closer to the city's edges. She would have carried this doll through her childhood, would have perhaps confided to it her hopes and fears, her small triumphs and disappointments. And then she had grown, had married perhaps, had borne a daughter, and had passed the doll along, saying, "This was mine when I was your age. I want you to have it now." The second Mary, the granddaughter, had lived in more recent times. Her childhood would have overlapped with Mr. Bellamy's adulthood. She would have known a world of gas lamps and horse-drawn omnibuses, of growing cities and increasing industry. She would have held this same doll, would have dressed and undressed it, would have tucked it into bed beside her at night, and then she had died. Mr. Bellamy did not know the circumstances, whether it had been illness or accident, whether it had been sudden or lingering, and the doll had survived her, had outlasted the young life that had loved it. Standing there in the quiet morning light, Mr. Bellamy found himself thinking about the strange relationship between things and time. about how objects persist while lives are so brief. A toy made from wood and cloth and paint could last for generations if cared for properly, could be passed from hand to hand, could accumulate layers of meaning and memory, like a stone gathering moss. Was there something sad in this, or something beautiful? He could not quite decide. Both, perhaps? Sad because it was a reminder of mortality, of the fact that all people pass away while the things they made or owned endure. Beautiful because it meant that love could be preserved, that the care someone invested in an object could continue to resonate long after they were gone. He thought about all the toys he had made over the decades of his working life. Where were they now? Some would have been destroyed, certainly, broken beyond repair, damaged by fire or water, simply worn out by intensive play. But others would still exist somewhere, in attics or cupboards, on shelves or in trunks. And a few, perhaps, were still being played with, had been passed down from parent to child, were still providing comfort and companionship to a new generation. The thought pleased him. To imagine that somewhere in London or beyond, a child might be playing with a toy he had carved 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, might be finding the same kind of joy in it that the original owner had found. There was something deeply satisfying in that idea. Mr. Bellamy moved to the window and looked out at the street, which was beginning to show signs of morning activity. A milk cart passed by, the horses' hooves making their familiar clip-clop rhythm on the cobblestones. A lamplighter was extinguishing the gas lamps, moving from post to post with his long pole. A few early pedestrians hurried past, shoulders hunched against the cold. All of these people had been children once. All of them had played with toys, had loved or at least enjoyed some object that had been special to them in their youth. And where were those toys now? Forgotten, most likely. Discarded or lost or destroyed by time and circumstance. But the memories remained, perhaps. Even if the physical object was gone, even if a person could not recall the exact appearance of their favorite toy, there might still be a residual feeling, a warmth associated with play and imagination, and the freedom of childhood. And if that were so, then perhaps the toys had fulfilled their purpose, had given what they were meant to give, even if they had not physically endured. Mr. Bellamy thought about the little girl Annie Fletcher, who had come to his shop several days earlier and had purchased the small brown horse for her ailing brother. Where was that horse now? Being clutched in a sick child's hands, perhaps, being galloped across rumpled bedclothes, carrying an imaginary rider to imaginary destinations, providing comfort and distraction to a boy who was confined to bed and could not run and play as he wished. That toy would accumulate its own history, would become part of that child's story. And someday, when the boy was grown, he might remember it, might recall the day his sister brought it to him, might remember the adventures he had imagined for it, might feel a distant echo of the comfort it had provided during a difficult time. This was the true value of toys, Mr. Bellamy thought. Not their monetary worth, not the skill required to make them, but their capacity to serve as companions, as catalysts for imagination, as anchors for memory. They were small vessels into which children could pour their affections, their dreams, their need for something to love and care for. He returned to his workbench and sat down, his hands coming to rest on the piece of wood he had been carving the previous afternoon. A bear's head, still rough, requiring much more work before it would be ready for painting. He picked up his carving knife, but did not immediately begin to work. Instead, he held it quietly, thinking about all the toys this knife had helped to create over the years. all the small wooden forms it had helped to coax forth from blocks of lime or cherry or oak. His father's hands had guided this knife before his own. His father had carved with it, had shaped toy after toy, had invested each one with care and attention. And now Mr. Bellamy's hands performed the same work, following the same principles, creating for a new generation of children the same kinds of companions his father had created for an earlier generation. There was comfort in this continuity, in being part of a tradition that stretched backward and forward through time. He was not merely an individual craftsman working in isolation. He was a link in a chain, receiving skills and knowledge from those who had come before and passing them on, if only through the toys themselves, to those who would come after. What would become of his workshop when he was gone? He had no children to inherit it, no apprentice to carry on the work. Likely the shop would be cleared out, his tools sold or discarded, his remaining stock of toys distributed somehow. The building would be taken over by some other business, and the long history of toy making in this location would come to an end. The thought saddened him, but only mildly. Everything ended eventually. Workshops closed, traditions faded, skills were lost or transformed. This was the nature of time, of change, of the world's constant movement forward. He had done his work, had made his toys, had contributed what he could contribute. That would have to be enough. And yet, some of his toys would survive him, would continue to exist and be played with and loved. In that sense, something of him would persist. Not his name, perhaps, not his identity, but his care, his craftsmanship, the love he had invested in his work. These things would endure in the toys themselves, invisible but present, a kind of gift given to children he would never meet, in times he would never see. Mr. Bellamy lifted his knife and began to work on the bear's head, the blade moving in its familiar rhythms, the wood shavings beginning to accumulate on the bench before him. As he carved, his mind grew quiet, focused on the immediate task, on the feel of the wood and the angle of the blade. But beneath that focused attention, beneath the conscious thought required by the work, there ran a current of deeper feeling, a sense of connection to all the other toy makers who had ever lived, all the other craftspeople who had devoted their lives to creating things of beauty and utility for others. He was not alone. Even in his solitary workshop, he was part of something larger, something that transcended individual lives and connected hands across time. The morning light grew gradually brighter, the street sounds increased, the day began in earnest, and Mr. Arthur Bellamy worked on, his hands shaping wood, his mind holding gently the awareness of memory and meaning, creating with patience and care the small wooden companions that would carry forward, in their quiet way, into an unknown future. The Toymaker of Covent Garden. Part 7. Evening light in the workshop. The afternoon had worn on in its quiet way, and now the light was changing, taking on the particular quality that comes in the hour before sunset. Mr. Bellamy paused in his work and looked toward the window, where the gray sky of morning had transformed into something softer. Warmer bands of pale gold and rose visible between the rooftops, the clouds catching the fading sun and holding its light like precious things cupped in careful hands. He set down the small paintbrush he had been using. He had been adding delicate details to a toy theater, tiny flowers painted on the proscenium arch, and rose from his stool, moving to the window to better see the sky. The street outside was quieter now than it had been earlier in the day. The market had closed, the vendors had packed their barrows and gone home, and only a few pedestrians remained, hurrying toward their own suppers and firesides. The light from the setting sun slanted through the window at a low angle, illuminating the dust motes that drifted through the air and casting long shadows across the workshop floor. It touched the toys on their shelves, making the painted surfaces glow softly, bringing out depths of color that had not been visible in the flat light of midday. A wooden horse caught the light and seemed almost to shimmer. A row of tin soldiers stood in formation, their painted uniforms brilliant for this brief moment before the light faded entirely. Mr. Bellamy stood at the window, simply watching as the sky continued its slow transformation. This was one of his favorite times of day, this transition from afternoon to evening, when the world grew quiet and the light became beautiful, and there was a sense of things settling, of the day's work drawing toward its close. Behind him, the lamps in his workshop glowed steadily, their warm yellow light a counterpoint to the cooler light from outside. He had lit them an hour ago, when the afternoon had begun to dim, and now they created a space of warmth and comfort that felt increasingly separate from the darkening street beyond the window. The workshop was becoming an island of light, a haven against the approaching night. He turned from the window and surveyed his domain. The workbench held the projects he had been engaged with throughout the day: the toy theater with its half-painted flowers, a set of building blocks awaiting their final coat of varnish, a partially carved figure that would eventually become a shepherd for a nativity scene. Each piece represented hours of careful work, and each would require more hours still before it was complete. But there was no hurry. The work would be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Mr. Bellamy moved to the small spirit stove in the corner and set the kettle to boil for his evening tea. This, too, was part of the ritual of his days. This pause, as afternoon became evening. This moment of rest and reflection before the final hours of work that would carry him to closing time. While the water heated, he tidied his workbench, arranging tools, wiping down surfaces, sweeping the accumulated wood shavings and paint scrapings into his dustpan. The workshop was never completely clean. Sawdust seemed to generate itself, appearing in corners and crevices no matter how often he swept. But he liked to maintain a certain level of order to ensure that his workspace was ready for the next day's labor. The kettle began to sing, its whistle soft and almost musical, in the quiet workshop. Mr. Bellamy prepared his tea with the same methodical care he brought to all his tasks, warming the pot, measuring the leaves, pouring the water, allowing it to steep while he fetched a cup and saucer from the small shelf where he kept such things. He poured the tea when it was ready, added a small amount of milk from the jug he had brought down from his rooms that morning, and carried the cup to his chair near the fire. The fire had burned low during the afternoon, and he added a few pieces of coal to it now, watching as they caught and began to glow, sending up small flames that danced and flickered in the grate. Settling into his chair, tea in hand, Mr. Bellamy allowed himself to simply sit for a while, doing nothing, thinking nothing in particular, merely existing in this moment of quietness and rest. Outside, the sunset continued its slow progression, the colors in the sky deepening from pale gold and rose to richer shades of amber and crimson. The street lamps were being lit. He could see the lamplighter passing by, his familiar figure bent to his task, each lamp blooming into light as he touched it with his long pole. The sounds from outside were fading now. A cart rumbled past, its wheels making their familiar rumble on the cobblestones. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour. 6 chimes, clear and measured. A dog barked, the sound carrying in the cooling air, but these sounds were growing fewer, softer, as if the city itself were settling down for the evening, drawing breath before the night. Mr. Bellamy sipped his tea and felt the warmth spread through him. The day had been a good one, not remarkable, not particularly eventful, but good in the way that simple days of honest work are good. He had made progress on several projects, had kept his workspace in order, had tended to the small details that required attention. There was satisfaction in this, in the accumulation of small accomplishments, in the steady forward movement of his craft. The fire crackled softly, sending shadows dancing across the ceiling. The lamps burned with their steady, unwavering light. The toys on their shelves stood silent and patient, each one holding its particular character, its own small presence. The rocking horse seemed poised to move if only someone would climb onto its back. The dolls sat or stood in various attitudes, their painted faces serene. The soldiers maintained their eternal formation, ready for campaigns that would be fought only in imagination. Mr. Bellamy thought about all the evenings he had spent in this chair, in this workshop, over all the years of his working life. Thousands of evenings, each one much like this one, each one bringing its own particular quality of light and shadow, its own configuration of sounds from the street outside, its own texture of thoughts and feelings, and yet each one unique, unrepeatable, a moment that would come once and never again. There was something both melancholy and comforting in this awareness. Melancholy because it was a reminder of time's passage, of the way days accumulated into years and years into a lifetime, of the fact that he was old now and would not have infinitely many more such evenings. Comforting because it made each evening precious, made this moment of sitting with his tea by the fire something to be appreciated, to be fully inhabited rather than rushed through on the way to something else. He finished his tea and set the cup aside, then simply sat, watching the fire, listening to the quiet sounds of the workshop, the soft ticking of the clock, the occasional settling of coals in the grate, the faint creaking of the building as it adjusted to the cooling evening air. The sky outside had darkened further now, the sunset colors fading into deep blue and purple. The street lamps provided the primary illumination, their light making small pools on the pavement, leaving the spaces between in shadow. A few people still passed by, their figures briefly visible as they moved through the lamplight, then disappearing again into darkness. Mr. Bellamy rose from his chair and moved about the workshop, adjusting a lamp here, straightening a tool there, his movements slow and contemplative. He paused before the shelf where the cloth doll and his childhood soldier stood together and reached up to adjust the doll's faded blue dress, which had become slightly disarranged. The doll's painted face looked back at him, peaceful and patient, and he felt a surge of affection for this old toy that had survived so much, that held within its worn fabric such a weight of memory and meaning. "Good evening," he said softly to the doll and to the soldier beside it, and perhaps to all the other toys on all the other shelves, each one waiting for its moment, each one ready to bring joy or comfort to whatever child would eventually claim it. He returned to his workbench and took up the toy theater again, examining it in the lamplight. The painted flowers on the proscenium arch were nearly complete. A few more touches, and they would be finished. He picked up his smallest brush, dipped it carefully in paint, and began to add the final details, working slowly and precisely, his hand steady despite his years. As he worked, the evening deepened into night, The last traces of sunset faded from the sky. The street outside grew quieter still, the sounds becoming more occasional, more distant. Inside the workshop, the lamps burned on, creating a warm cocoon of light against the darkness beyond the windows. Mr. Bellamy worked without hurrying, adding tiny touches of color to the theater's painted decorations, losing himself in the meditative rhythm of the work. The brush moved across the wood surface with delicate precision, leaving behind trails of paint that caught the lamplight and glowed softly. Each stroke was deliberate, considered, the product of years of practice, and an attention that had become almost instinctive. Time passed, marked only by the steady ticking of the clock and the gradual transformation of the toy theater from nearly finished to complete. When the last flower was painted and the last detail added, Mr. Bellamy set down his brush and held the theater up to the light, turning it slowly, examining his work from all angles. It was good. The proportions were correct. The painting was careful and precise. The whole piece had the quality of rightness that came when craft and care combined successfully. Some child would receive this theater and would put on plays with it, would create stories and performances, would populate its small stage with imagination and wonder. He set the theater aside to dry and cleaned his brushes carefully, washing away the paint with turpentine and then water, drying them on a soft cloth, returning them to their jar. The workbench was tidied, tools put away, surfaces wiped clean. The day's work was done. Mr. Bellamy stood in the center of his workshop, looking around at the space that had been the center of his life for so many years. The lamps cast their warm light across familiar surfaces. The fire had settled into a steady glow. The toys on their shelves waited patiently. And outside, beyond the windows, the night had fully arrived, wrapping the city in darkness, while here, in this small shop in Covent Garden, warmth and light persisted, a small refuge against the dark. He felt peaceful, content, ready for the evening's remaining hours and whatever they might bring. The day had been good, the work had been satisfying, and now the night was here, bringing with it the promise of rest and the certainty that tomorrow would bring another day, another morning, another opportunity to continue the quiet work of creating small vessels of joy from wood and paint and imagination. Part 8. A Visitor from Long Ago. The next afternoon brought with it a visitor that Mr. Bellamy had not expected, though in truth he welcomed very few visitors and expected even fewer. He was at his workbench, engaged in the delicate work of attaching the tiny brass hinges to a wooden music box, when he heard the soft tapping at his door. 3 gentle knocks, patient and unhurried. He set down his tools and rose, crossing the workshop to answer. When he opened the door, he found standing there an elderly woman, perhaps a few years younger than himself, dressed in clothing that spoke of genteel poverty, good fabric, and careful maintenance, but styles that were no longer quite fashionable, colors that had faded with many washings. Her face was deeply lined but kind, and her eyes held a quality of gentle determination mixed with uncertainty. "Mr. Bellamy?" she asked, her voice soft and cultured. "I hope I am not intruding. I wonder if I might speak with you for a few moments." "Of course," Mr. Bellamy said, stepping back to allow her entrance. "Please, do come in. How may I be of service to you?" The woman entered slowly, looking around the workshop with an expression that seemed to combine nostalgia with something approaching wonder. "It has been many years since I was last in this shop," she said quietly. "Many years indeed." I was not certain I would find it still here, still unchanged. Mr. Bellamy studied her face, trying to place her, but the memory would not come. I apologize, he said. I fear my memory is not what it once was. Have we met before? We have, the woman said, though it was a very long time ago. More than 20 years, I should think. My name is Mary Thornton then. I am Mrs. Mary Ashford now, these past 15 years. But you would have known me as Mary Thornton. Mary Thornton. The name stirred something in Mr. Bellamy's memory, a distant recognition. And then, quite suddenly, understanding came. You are the daughter of Mrs. Millicent Thornton, he said softly. The first Mary. The woman's eyes widened slightly. You remember? She said, her voice touched with emotion. After all these years, you remember. I remember your mother bringing a doll to be repaired, Mr. Bellamy said. A cloth doll in a blue dress. She said it had been yours when you were a child and that your daughter, also named Mary, had inherited it and loved it dearly. Mrs. Ashford nodded, tears beginning to gather in her eyes. Yes, she said. Yes, that is right. My daughter Mary. She died when she was 8 years old, not long after my mother brought the doll here for repair. A fever that came suddenly and could not be broken. It has been more than 20 years now, but she paused, pressing her lips together, composing herself. Time softens the grief, but it never quite removes it. I am so very sorry, Mr. Bellamy said gently. Please, come and sit down. May I offer you some tea? Mrs. Ashford accepted gratefully, and Mr. Bellamy busied himself with preparing tea, while his visitor settled into the chair near the fire. As the water heated, he found himself thinking about the connections between the past and present, about how lives touched and separated, and sometimes, unexpectedly, touched again. When the tea was ready, he poured 2 cups and carried them to the fireside, settling into the second chair with a slight sigh of relief. His knees had been bothering him today, and sitting was more comfortable than standing. I have thought about this shop many times over the years, Mrs. Ashford said, accepting her tea with a small nod of thanks. After my daughter died, my mother brought the doll back to you. She could not bear to keep it, you see. Every time she saw it, she thought of Mary, and the pain was too great. She asked if you would keep it here, and you agreed, out of kindness. I have always remembered that kindness. It was a small thing, Mr. Bellamy said. Your mother was grieving. How could I refuse such a request? Many would have, Mrs. Ashford said, but you did not. And now, well, I have come to ask about the doll. My mother died 3 years ago, and before she passed, she spoke of it. She said she had been wrong to give it away, that it should have remained in the family, that it held too much memory to be abandoned. She asked me to try to retrieve it if it still existed. I know it is a great deal to ask after so many years, but I wondered. Mr. Bellamy set down his teacup and rose. He crossed to the shelf where the cloth doll stood beside his childhood soldier and carefully lifted it down. He carried it back to Mrs. Ashford and held it out to her. It is here, he said simply. It has been waiting. Mrs. Ashford took the doll with trembling hands, and the tears that had been gathering in her eyes spilled over. She held the doll close to her chest, much as a child might hold it, and wept quietly for several moments. Mr. Bellamy sat in respectful silence, allowing her the space to feel what she needed to feel. When she had composed herself, Mrs. Ashford looked at the doll more carefully. examining it as one might examine an old friend, not seen in many years. "It is exactly as I remember," she said wonderingly. "The blue dress, the painted face, the yarn hair. I made this doll myself, you know, when I was perhaps 14 or 15. I was learning to sew, and my mother suggested I make a doll as practice. I remember choosing the fabric for the dress, painting the face with such care, and then I gave it to my own daughter when she was small, and she loved it just as I had loved it. It shows the signs of much love," Mr. Bellamy said gently. "That is the best thing one can say about a toy." Mrs. Ashford nodded, running her fingers over the doll's faded dress. "I embroidered my initials on the back," she said. "M.T. Mary Thornton, as I was then. I wanted to mark it as mine, to claim it somehow. How foolish and how young I was. We all wish to leave our mark, to say I was here, I made this, I mattered. There was nothing foolish in that." Mr. Bellamy walked her to the door, moving slowly, feeling the weight of the day and the years in his bones. At the threshold, Mrs. Ashford paused and turned to him. "We live such brief lives," she said quietly, "and yet the things we make, the love we give, these can endure. My mother made this doll for me. I gave it to my daughter. Now I give it to my granddaughter. And perhaps someday she will give it to her own daughter. The people may pass away, but the love remains, held in cloth and paint and memory." "That is a beautiful thought," Mr. Bellamy said. "I hope it proves true." They said their farewells, and Mr. Bellamy watched from the doorway as Mrs. Ashford made her way down the street, the basket, with its precious contents, held carefully in her hands. She walked slowly, but with evident purpose, and he continued watching until she turned the corner and disappeared from view. He closed the door and returned to his workshop, feeling a mixture of emotions he could not quite name. Sadness for the loss of the doll, which had become a familiar presence during its years on his shelf, but also deep satisfaction that it was returning to the family that had created it, that it would know the hands of another child, that its story would continue. He looked at the shelf where the doll had stood, now holding only his childhood soldier. The soldier seemed somehow lonely without its companion, standing at attention in solitary vigil. Mr. Bellamy reached up and adjusted the soldier's position slightly, turning it so that it faced outward toward the workshop rather than toward the wall. "You are the keeper of memories now," he said softly to the small wooden figure. "You must remember for both of you." The afternoon continued its quiet progression toward evening, and Mr. Bellamy returned to his work, his hands taking up familiar tools, his mind holding gently the awareness that he had been witness to something significant, not grand or dramatic, but meaningful in the way that small acts of preservation and return are meaningful, in the way that connections across time and loss can sometimes be unexpectedly restored. Outside, the street grew gradually darker, the sounds of commerce fading into the quieter sounds of evening. Inside, the lamps burned steadily, the fire glowed in its grate, and the work continued, patient and unhurried, as it had for decades and would continue for as long as strength remained. Life moved in its cycles, loss and recovery, separation and reunion, endings and beginnings. And through it all, the small things persisted. A wooden soldier on a shelf, a cloth doll returning home, the steady work of hands creating toys for children who would love them, lose them, remember them, and perhaps, if fortune smiled, find them again when they were most needed. Part 9. Closing the workshop. The evening had settled fully over Covent Garden by the time Mr. Bellamy began his preparations for closing the shop. The clock on the mantelpiece showed 7:30, and though there was work he could still do, there was also the recognition that his body was tired, that his eyes were growing weary from the close work of the day, that it was time to bring this day to its conclusion and allow himself the rest he had earned. He stood in the center of his workshop, looking around at the familiar space with the appreciation that comes from long association. The lamps cast their warm light across the workbench, across the shelves of toys, across the tools that hung on their pegs or rested in their designated places. Everything was much as it had been that morning, and yet subtly different. The work had progressed. Pieces had moved from one stage of completion to the next. The day had left its mark in small ways. Mr. Bellamy began with the fire, as he always did. It had burned low during the evening, and now consisted mostly of glowing coals and fine ash. He took the poker and carefully spread the coals evenly across the grate, then covered them with ash from the bucket, enough to bank the fire safely, to preserve a small core of heat that could be revived in the morning, but not so much as to completely smother it. The fire's light dimmed as he worked, the red glow gradually being obscured by the gray ash, until only the faintest suggestion of warmth remained visible. Next, he turned his attention to his workbench. The music box he had been working on earlier lay there, its tiny brass hinges now properly attached, waiting only for its mechanism to be installed. He examined it once more in the lamplight, checking that the hinges moved smoothly, that the joints were secure, that everything was as it should be. Satisfied, he set it aside carefully, placing it on a shelf where it would be safe until he could return to it tomorrow. The rest of the workbench required tidying. He gathered the small brass screws that had not been used and returned them to their compartmented box. The screwdriver was wiped clean and returned to its place in the tool rack. The fine sandpaper he had used to smooth the wood around the hinges was folded neatly and set aside for future use. Each action was deliberate, unhurried, part of the ritual that marked the transition from work to rest. He moved methodically around the workshop, attending to each area in turn. The paintbrushes were checked to ensure they had been properly cleaned. He had washed them earlier, but it was his habit to check again, for a brush left with dried paint in its bristles was a brush ruined. He found them all clean and soft, standing in their jar like a small forest of wooden handles and fine bristles. The pots of paint were examined to ensure their lids were tight. He had learned long ago that paint left exposed to air would dry and become useless, and he was meticulous about sealing each pot after use. He found one lid that was slightly loose and tightened it, then arranged all the pots in their proper order on the shelf, reds and blues and yellows and greens and browns, each one labeled in his careful handwriting. The carving knives required special attention. Each one was examined for cleanliness, for any trace of wood sap or resin that might have accumulated on the blade. He found them all satisfactory, but he nevertheless wiped each one with a lightly oiled cloth, maintaining the steel, preventing rust, ensuring they would be ready when next he needed them. Then, each knife was returned to its place in the wooden rack, arranged by size and purpose, the way his father had taught him, the way his grandfather had taught his father. Mr. Bellamy swept the floor next, gathering the day's accumulation of wood shavings and sawdust into a small pile, then transferring this to the wooden box, where such things were kept. The shavings were soft and fragrant, carrying the scent of the various woods he had worked with, pine and basswood and cherry, each one contributing its own particular perfume to the mixture. He lifted a handful and let it fall back into the box, watching the way the curled shavings drifted and settled, light as paper, delicate as lace. When the floor was swept, he moved to the windows. The shutters had remained open during the evening, allowing him to see the darkening street, but now it was time to close them, to seal the workshop against the night. He unlatched each shutter and swung it inward, the hinges creaking slightly, a sound so familiar he hardly noticed it, yet comforting in its consistency. The shutters were heavy, made of solid wood, and they closed out the world effectively, reducing the workshop to its own private domain, dependent only on the light of its lamps. With the shutters closed and latched, the workshop felt smaller, more intimate, like a room in a house rather than a place of business. Mr. Bellamy stood for a moment in the changed atmosphere, appreciating this transformation, this sense of enclosure and safety. He began to extinguish the lamps, starting with the one farthest from the door and working his way forward. Each lamp required its own small ritual: the glass chimney to be lifted carefully, the wick to be lowered until the flame diminished and went out, the chimney to be replaced, the whole lamp to be left tidy for the morning. As each lamp was extinguished, the workshop grew dimmer, the shadows deepening, the pools of light becoming fewer and smaller. He left one lamp burning, the one nearest the door, and by its light he made a final circuit of the workshop, checking that everything was in order, that nothing had been overlooked. His eyes moved over the shelves of toys, each one standing or sitting in its place, patient and still. The rocking horse with its real horsehair mane, the set of 9 pins painted in bright colors, the Noah's Ark with its procession of tiny animals, the soldiers in their formation, the dolls in their various dresses. His gaze came to rest on the shelf where his childhood soldier stood alone now, the cloth doll having been reclaimed by its family. The soldier seemed to stand even more at attention than usual, bearing its solitude with dignity. Mr. Bellamy reached up and touched the small wooden figure gently, just for a moment, a gesture of acknowledgement and affection. "Good night, old friend," he said softly. "Stand watch over the others while I am upstairs." He moved to his desk and checked his account book, ensuring that the day's transactions had been properly recorded. There had been few. A customer had collected a repaired top in the morning, and another had commissioned a set of building blocks to be completed by next week. But each was noted in his careful handwriting, with the date and details and amounts. The ledger was closed and returned to its drawer. The cash box was checked, the day's modest receipts counted and found correct. He locked the box and placed it in the drawer of his desk, then locked the drawer itself, tucking the small key into his waistcoat pocket, where it lived alongside his watch. Everything was attended to now. Everything was in order. The workshop was ready for the night, prepared to rest until morning should call it back to wakefulness. At the top of the stairs, he paused and looked back down at the closed door of his workshop. Behind that door, the toys waited in darkness. The fire held its small core of warmth. The day's work stood ready for tomorrow's continuation. All was well. All was as it should be. Mr. Arthur Bellamy turned away from the stairs and moved toward his rooms, towards supper and reading, and eventually sleep, carrying with him the quiet contentment of honest work, completed, of tools properly tended, of a workshop left in perfect order, ready to receive the gift of another morning when it should come. Art 10. When the toys grow quiet, in the deep hours of the night, when the city had settled into its quietest time, and even the sounds of distant revelry had faded to nothing, the toy workshop of Mr. Arthur Bellamy rested in a stillness so complete It seemed to exist outside the ordinary passage of time. The shutters were closed against the darkness beyond, admitting no light from the street lamps, no glimmer from the moon, if moon there was. The lamps had all been extinguished, their wicks cold, their chimneys dark. The fire in the grate had subsided to the merest whisper of warmth, the coals beneath their blanket of ash holding only the faintest suggestion of the heat that had filled the room during the day. In this darkness, the workshop held its own particular quality of presence. It was not the absence of things, not emptiness, but rather a fullness waiting in stillness, the patient presence of tools and toys, of wood and paint and cloth, of all the accumulated evidence of careful work and devoted craft. If there had been eyes to see, they would have perceived only shapes. The bulk of the workbench against one wall, the shelves rising toward the ceiling on all sides, the chair near the fireplace holding its form in the darkness. But the toys themselves were invisible, reduced to their essential existence, freed for these hours from the need to be seen or admired or played with. They simply were, existing in their own right, waiting with the patience that only inanimate things possess. The wooden soldier stood on his high shelf, one arm raised in eternal salute, his painted uniform now invisible in the darkness, but no less present for being unseen. He had stood thus for more than 60 years, had witnessed the passage of days and seasons and decades, had kept his vigil through all the changes that time had brought, and he would stand thus still, bearing his memories with silent dignity, holding close the knowledge of the child who had loved him and the man that child had become. Around him, on other shelves, his companions waited. The rocking horse stood frozen mid-gallop, its horsehair mane stirring very slightly in the imperceptible currents of air that moved through the workshop, even in stillness. The dolls sat or stood in their various poses, their painted faces serene in the darkness. The Noah's Ark held its cargo of tiny animals, each one carved with care, each one waiting to be discovered by some child who would give them names and voices and adventures. The tin soldiers maintained their formation, lined up in perfect rows, ready for campaigns that existed only in imagination. The building blocks sat stacked in their box, each one precisely cut and sanded, waiting to be built into towers and walls and castles. The mechanical bear with its wind-up key stood motionless, its mechanism still, but ready to lumber forward at the turn of a key and the touch of a child's hand. Each toy held within itself the potential for joy, for imagination, for the particular magic that happens when a child takes an object and transforms it through play into something alive, something meaningful, something beloved. But for now, in these deep night hours, they rested in their essential nature. Wood and cloth and paint and metal, shaped by human hands, imbued with care, waiting for their purpose to be activated. The darkness was not empty of sound, not quite. There was the soft ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece, so steady and regular it became almost inaudible, more a pulse than a sound, marking time in increments so small they seemed meaningless individually, but which, accumulated, made hours and days and lives. There was the occasional settling of the building itself, the wood beams adjusting to the night's cold, producing tiny creaks and sighs that spoke of age and endurance. And beneath these sounds, beneath even the threshold of hearing, there might have been something else. Not a sound exactly, but a quality of presence that suggested the breathing of things that do not breathe, the quiet existence of objects that have been made with love and care, that hold within themselves the intentions of their maker and the anticipation of being loved by those for whom they were made. Above the workshop, in his small rooms, Mr. Bellamy slept the sleep of exhaustion and contentment, his breathing slow and regular, his old body resting from the day's labors. Perhaps he dreamed of toys and children, of wood and paint, of his father's hands teaching his own, of all the years of work that stretched behind him and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Or perhaps he dreamed of nothing at all, simply floating in that deep place of unconsciousness where the mind releases its grip and allows itself to drift, unmoored from worry or thought. In the street outside, London, too, was sleeping, or mostly sleeping. A cat moved silently along the pavement, intent on some nocturnal errand. A constable made his rounds, his footsteps echoing in the empty street, his lantern casting a small circle of light that moved with him and then passed on, leaving darkness in its wake. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, two low, solemn notes that spread through the darkness and faded, acknowledged by the night and then absorbed into its silence. But inside the workshop, these sounds arrived muffled and distant, as if from another world entirely. The shuttered windows kept most of the outside at bay, and the thick walls, built in a time when buildings were made to last, further insulated the space from the city beyond. The workshop existed in its own envelope of quietness, a small pocket of stillness in the midst of the city's vast and ceaseless being. Time moved differently here, or seemed to. Without light to mark its passing, without motion to give it measure, time became something elastic, something that could stretch or compress, that could seem to stop entirely while nonetheless continuing its inexorable forward movement. The night might last forever, or it might pass in an instant. In the darkness, both seemed equally true. The toys waited. They had waited before, would wait again. Waiting was what they did during these hours of darkness, holding themselves in readiness for the return of light and life. They did not grow impatient, did not long for morning. They simply existed, present and patient, content in their own stillness. On the workbench, the music box that Mr. Bellamy had been working on sat silent, its mechanism not yet installed, its small brass hinges catching no light because there was no light to catch. Beside it, the bear's head he had been carving waited in whatever state of incompletion he had left it in, neither concerned with its unfinished nature nor eager to be completed. All things in their own time, all work in its proper season. The fire in the grate had nearly exhausted itself now. The coals beneath the ash had cooled almost to the temperature of the surrounding air, holding only the faintest residual warmth, a memory of the heat they had once generated. By morning they would be cold entirely, gray ash and clinkers, ready to be cleared away and replaced with fresh fuel. But for now, they persisted in their liminal state, neither warm nor quite cold, suspended between what they had been and what they would become. The darkness itself seemed to have weight, seemed to press gently against all surfaces, filling every corner, occupying every space not already occupied by something else. It was not oppressive, this darkness, but rather comforting in its completeness, its totality. There was nothing to see, and therefore no need to look. There was nothing to do, and therefore no burden of undone tasks. There was only being, only existing, only the quiet presence of things waiting in their own time. If the toys could think, if they possessed consciousness of any kind, perhaps they would think of the children who would come for them, who would take them down from their shelves and carry them away to homes and lives the toys could not imagine. Perhaps they would wonder what hands would hold them, what games would be played with them, what stories would be told about them and with them. Or perhaps they would think of the hands that had made them, the careful fingers that had carved and painted and assembled them, that had given them shape and form and character. Perhaps they would remember, in whatever way toys remember, the lamplight falling across the workbench, the smell of wood and varnish, the soft sounds of tools being used with practiced skill. But more likely, if toys think at all, they thought of nothing, simply rested in their own being, content to exist, to wait, to serve whatever purpose they were meant to serve when the time for serving came. The night deepened further, if that were possible. The darkness became absolute. The silence grew more complete. The stillness settled into something profound, something that went beyond mere absence of motion and became instead a kind of presence in itself, the presence of peace, of rest, of the world holding its breath before beginning again. And in that stillness, in that profound quietness, there was something that might have been called happiness, if objects could be happy. The satisfaction of things being exactly as they should be, the contentment of tools waiting to be used, and toys waiting to be loved, and a workshop waiting to receive its maker's return when morning should come again. No hurry, no urgency, only the gentle passage of hours, marked by the faithful clock, held by the patient walls, witnessed by the silent toys who stood their vigil through all the watches of the night. Somewhere, dawn was preparing itself, gathering its light, readying for its eventual arrival. But that was hours away still, and those hours belonged to the darkness, belonged to the silence, belonged to the deep and restful peace of things at rest. The workshop breathed, though it had no lungs. The toys slept, though they had no need of sleep. The night continued its slow procession toward morning, patient and unhurried, carrying with it all the sleeping city, all the resting souls, all the quiet objects, waiting in darkness for light to find them again. And in that waiting, in that patient stillness, there was everything needful, everything sufficient, everything complete. Rest now. The toys keep their watch. The darkness holds all things gently, and the night moves on, carrying its cargo of silence and stillness toward the distant shore of morning. Rest. All is well. All is safe. All things wait, patient and peaceful, for the return of light. Sleep.